The City of Golden Lead by John Christopher. The City of Golden Lead. What chiefly worried me was that my true feelings would show when the tentacle gripped me, that I would not be able to avoid straining against it and marking myself out as different from the others. I even wondered if the tentacle could somehow read my thoughts. I remembered the feel of it, hard metal but weirdly resilient, pulsing with what seemed like life. When it was my turn to be lifted, I did my best to blank out what was happening. I thought instead of my home, of lazy afternoons wandering through the fields, of swimming in the river with my cousin Jack. Then the breath gasped from my body as I was plucked up and lifted through the rain-seeping air. Above me, the door in the hemisphere was open, a mouth growing larger as I was brought toward it. I was expecting the lapse into unconsciousness, which had occurred in my first encounter with the tripod outside the Château de la Tour Rouge, but it did not happen. Later I understood why. The tripods had a means of doing this, but they used it only on the uncapped, who might panic and struggle. There was no need for such restraint with those who had learned to worship them. The tentacle put me inside and released me, and I could take in my surroundings. The hemispheres were some 50 feet across the base, but the part we were in was much smaller, an irregularly shaped cell about 7 feet high. The outer wall with the door was curved and had portholes on either side, covered with what seemed to be very thick glass. The remaining walls were straight, but the side ones sloped inward, so that the interior wall was shorter than the external. There was another door there, I saw, but it was closed. There were no furnishings of any kind. I ran my fingernails over the metal and found it hard but satiny in texture. There were 6 in my group, and I had been the 5th to be taken. The last one was brought in, and the door closed, a raised, round flap coming down to make a tight seal. I looked at the faces of my companions. They showed some confusion, but excitement and exultation as well, which I did my best to copy. No one spoke, which was a help. I would not have known what to say or how to say it. Silence for endless minutes then. Abruptly, the floor tilted. The embarkation must have been completed. Our journey to the city had begun. The motion was extremely odd. The 3 legs of the tripod were attached to a circumferential ring beneath the hemispheres. At their points of attachment and where the legs joined were segments that could lengthen and shorten as the legs shifted relative to each other. There was also an arrangement of springs between the ring and the hemisphere that compensated for much of the jolting. What was left after the tilt when the tripod started to march was a mild rocking motion. It was a little nauseating at first, but one rapidly grew accustomed to it. The tripods could travel as easily in one direction as another by reason of their 3-legged symmetry, but at present the section we were in represented the front. We crowded to the portholes and looked out. Ahead, a little to our right, was the hill with the ancient semicircle of stone steps. Behind it, the town where, the night before, we had feasted. Beyond that again was the dark ribbon of the great river. We were going slightly north of east, heading toward it. The countryside beneath us was blurred and wet, but the rain had stopped and there was a patch of brightness in the cloud where the sun might be. Everything was small and far away. The fields and houses and cattle seen in the valley below from the tunnel had been tinier, but that panorama had been fixed, unchanging. Here, change was continual. It was like being in the belly of a huge, low-flying bird, flapping its way across the landscape. Remembering the tripods whose feet had served as boats, I wondered if these might do so too on reaching the river, but they did not. The forward legs sent up a fount of spray as it broke the surface, and the others followed. The tripod crossed the riverbed as a horseman would have forded the stream below my father's mill at Wharton. On the other side, it changed direction, turning south. There was open country and then desolation. Beanpole and I had seen something of this brooding ruin of one of the great cities on our way north. The river had flowed for miles between its black, unpromising shores, but from this high vantage point, one saw so much more. It stretched eastward from the river, a dark and ugly mass of destroyed buildings and broken roads. Trees had grown among them, but to a lesser extent than in the great city we had crossed on our journey south to the White Mountains. This place seemed to be vaster and uglier. I saw no remains of broad avenues and concourses, no sense here that our ancestors, before the tripods came, had lived lives of order and beauty. But there was an awareness of might and power, and I wondered again how they could have been defeated, how we, a handful of shattered remnants, could hope to succeed where they had failed. One of the others saw it first and cried out, and we jostled each other to look. It rose beyond the edge of the ruins, a ring of dull gold standing against the gray of the horizon, surmounted and roofed in by an enormous bubble of green-tinged crystal. The wall was more than 3 times as high as the tripods, smooth and unbroken. The whole place, although resting solidly on the earth, seemed strangely unconnected with it. Some distance from the point for which we were making, a river bubbled up from under the shield of gold and flowed away toward the mother river behind us. The eye, following its course, could almost imagine that the city was not there at all, that if one looked hard enough, the illusion would vanish, and there would be just the river running through ordinary fields. But it did not vanish. The wall rose higher as we approached, becoming more awful and forbidding. The sky grew lighter. From one instant to the next, the sun broke through the mask of clouds. Sunlight glistened on the ramparts, reflected from the crystal roof. We saw a great band of gleaming gold, on which flashed a titanic emerald, and I saw a narrow slit of darkness which widened. A door opened in the seamless wall. The first of the tripods marched through. What happened as our tripod entered the city was something for which I was completely unprepared. I felt as though I had been struck a savage blow, but a blow that contrived to hit me in every part of my body at the same time. A blow from the front, from behind, most of all from above, smashing me down. I staggered and fell, and saw my companions do the same. The floor of the compartment pulled us as though it were a magnet, and we were flakes of iron. I struggled to rise, and I realized it was not a blow, but something different. All my limbs had turned to lead. It was an effort to raise my arm, even to twitch a finger. I strained and stood up. I was carrying a tremendous burden on my back. Nor on my back alone, on every square inch of bone and muscle in my body. The others followed suit. They looked puzzled and frightened, but they still did not look unhappy. After all, what the tripods wished on them was good. It must be. There was dim green light. It was as though one were very far down in a thick forest or in a cave under the sea. I tried to make sense of it all, but could not. The weight of my body bowed my shoulders. I straightened myself up, but felt them sag again. Time passed, and we waited. There was silence and heaviness and greenness. I tried to concentrate on what must be the most important thing, that we had achieved our first objective and were inside the tripod's city. One must have patience. It was not, as Julius had pointed out, my most outstanding quality, but I had to cultivate it now. Waiting would have been easier without the dimness and the crushing weight. It would have been a relief to say something, anything, but I dared not. I shifted my feet, seeking a stance of greater ease, but not finding one. I had been looking at the door on the inner wall, but it was the other that opened, swinging back and up with a faint whirring noise. There was still nothing to be seen outside, just a high dim green. A tentacle came in and lifted one of my companions out. I realized that it must be able to see independently of the hemisphere. Might it still be that the tripods themselves were alive, that we were the captives of living and intelligent machines? The tentacle returned. This time it took me. It was like a hall, long and narrow, but of enormous size, probably 80 feet high, and 2 or 3 times that in length. I saw that it was a kind of stable for tripods. Against one wall, a long row of them stretched away into the green dusk, faintly illumined by hanging globes that gave a dim green light. Their hemispheres rested close against the wall far above us. Those in which we had traveled were unloading their human cargo. I saw Fritz, but did not speak to him. We had agreed that no contact should be attempted until the first stage, whatever that proved to be, was safely over. One by one, the others joined us. At last, the tentacle hung limp and inactive. A voice spoke. This too sounded as though it might have been the voice of a machine. It was deep and toneless, echoing and booming in the vast space. The words were in the German language that we knew. Humans, you have the privilege, the high honor, to have been chosen as servants of the masters. Go where the blue light shines. In the place to which it leads you, you will find fellow slaves who will instruct you in what you are to do. Follow the blue light. It had come on while the voice was speaking, a light that glowed deep blue in the base of the wall by which the tripods were standing. We walked toward it, or staggered rather, against the drag of this leaden weight that pulled us down, and the air was hotter, I thought, than it had been inside the tripod, and clammy, like the moment before summer thunder. The light was above an open door, which admitted us to a small room, much the same size as that in the tripod, but a regular cube. The door closed when we were all in. There was a click and another whir, and suddenly the weight was even greater, seeming to drag my stomach down with it in a swoop of nausea. This lasted several seconds, and was followed by a brief sensation of lightness. The whirring stopped. The door opened, and we walked out into another room. This also was large, although modest in comparison with the hall of the tripods, but of more conventional proportions. There was the same green glow from lamps that studded the walls. Their light, I saw, did not flicker the way our lamps did. I had a confused impression of rows of tables, or benches rather, and of half-naked old men. They were the ones who, the voice said, were to instruct us. They wore only shorts, reminding me of men who worked in the harvest fields, but there was no other resemblance. The green light tricked the eyes, but even so I could see that their skins were pallid and unhealthy. But were they as old as they seemed? They walked like old men, and their skin fell into the folds of age, but in other ways they came to us, one to each, and I followed my guide to one of the benches. A little pile of articles was laid out there. Most of them were self-explanatory. There were 2 pairs of shorts, like the ones our instructors were wearing, 2 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of shoes. No, 1 pair of shoes and 1 of sandals, the latter, I was told, for indoor wear. But there was also a device that baffled me. He explained it in a tired voice, a South German accent. You must put this on before you go through the airlock, and wear it always while you breathe the master's air. In the house of your own master, you will have a room in which to eat and sleep, where you will not need it, but otherwise it must never be removed. The air of the masters is too powerful for such as we. If you go into it without protection, you will die. It was like glass in that one could see through it, but was different to the touch. Even the thicker part, which fitted over the head and rested on the shoulders, would yield a little when one pressed it, and it tapered to a thin stuff that molded itself to the body. There was a belt that went round the chest, high under the arms, and could be tightened to hold the helmet on firmly. On either side of the neck were pouches holding a dark green sponge-like material. These had a network of fine holes, on both outside and inside, admitting air. The sponges, it seemed, could filter out the part of the master's air that was too strong for their slaves to breathe. My instructor pointed to it. This must be changed every day. Your master will supply you with new ones. Who is my master? I asked. It was a foolish question. He stared at me blankly. Your master will choose you. I reminded myself that my policy must be to lie low and say nothing, observing, not questioning. But there was one thing I could not avoid asking. How long have you been in the city? 2 years. But you're not. The remnants of pride broke through the heavy dullness of his voice. He said, I won the 1,000 meters race at the Games less than a month after I was capped. No one had ever done that before in my province. I stared at him, at the slumped, tired body, the worn, sick-looking flesh, with horror. He was no more than 2 years older than I was, perhaps less. Change into these clothes. His voice was once more blank and expressionless. Throw your old ones on that pile. I took off my scarlet champion's belt. What about this? Put it with the rest, he said. You do not need it in the city. We dressed in our new clothes, putting the articles we did not require immediately into a small bag we were given, and fastened on our masks. Then we were marshaled and led away and through a door into another smaller room. The door closed behind us, and I saw there was an identical one on the opposite side. There was a hissing sound, and I could feel a breeze over my feet. I realized that air was being drawn into a grill that ran along the base of the wall, but air was also coming in from another grill, just above head level. I could feel it, and after a time I thought I could see it. thicker, greener in the green light. In some strange way, the air was being changed in this room, the ordinary kind being replaced by that which the masters breathed. It continued for several minutes. Then the hissing stopped. The door in front opened, and we were told to walk out. It was the heat that struck me first. I had thought it was hot enough inside the tripod and in the outer room of the city, but that was mild in comparison with the furnace blast that I had now encountered. And yet not a furnace blast, because the air was damp as well as hot. Sweat started to pour out all over my body, but particularly on my head, encased in its hard, transparent cover. It trickled down my face and neck to the place high on my chest where the belt trapped it against my skin. I drew in gulping breaths of hot, stifling air. I felt weak, and the weight dragged me down. My knees started to buckle. One of my companions fell, and then a second and a third. Two of them struggled back to their feet in a moment or two. The third lay still. I thought of helping him, but remembered my resolution not to take a lead in anything. I was glad of the excuse to do nothing. Keeping myself from falling or fainting was difficult enough. Gradually, I became a little more accustomed to things and could look at what lay in front of us. We had come out on a kind of ledge, and the main thoroughfares of the city lay below us. It was an eye-wrenching confusion. None of the roads was straight, and few of them were level. They dipped and rose and curved between the buildings, and were lost in the dim green distance. The city seemed even vaster inside than it had seemed from the porthole of the tripod, but I had an idea that was because of the thicker, greener air. One could not really see very far with any clarity. The crystal dome that covered everything was invisible from here. The green dusk seemed to stretch endlessly. The buildings astonished me too. They were in different shapes and sizes, but of one general form, the pyramid. Immediately below our ledge, I saw a number of squat, broad-based pyramids. Farther off, there were thinner, more tapering constructions that rose to differing heights, the smallest seeming almost as high as the ledge, but others much taller. There were what looked like windows in them, triangular in shape, but dotted about the walls in no kind of pattern that I could understand. I made my eyes tired to look at them. Strange carriages moved along the ramps. These too, broadly speaking, were pyramids, but resting on one side rather than on the base, which in this case formed the rear. The top parts were of a transparent material like our helmets, and I could see figures in them, but only very indistinctly. Other figures moved on the spaces between the buildings and the ledges, which jutted from them at irregular intervals. They were of two kinds, one much smaller than the other. Although at this distance one could not make out particular features, it was obvious that one kind was the masters, the other their human slaves, because the smaller creatures moved slowly as though dragging heavy weights, while the larger ones moved lightly and quickly. One of our instructors said, "Behold, these are the dwellings of the masters." His voice, though muffled, was reverential. Beneath the pouches with the sponges were small metal devices. These, I found, carried sounds through the mask. The sounds were distorted, but to this, as to the other things, one grew accustomed in time. He raised a pointing hand in the direction of one of the nearer pyramids. "And there is the choosing place. Let us go down." We made our slow and staggering way down a spiral ramp, whose steepness threw an extra aching strain on the muscles of our legs, causing falls now and then. The boy who had fainted up on the ledge had revived and was with us. He was the one who had beaten Beanpole in the long jump, the gingery, freckle-faced lad who had managed to put that extra effort into his final jump. He would not jump far here. The heat, too, continued to drain our strength away, and the sweat running down formed an unpleasant puddle at the base of the mask. I wanted desperately to wipe it away, but of course that was impossible. To do so, I would have had to take the mask off, and, as I had been warned, this meant death in the air that the masters breathed. I still had not seen one of the masters close enough for them to be anything but a blur, but at least one problem was solved. The tripods were not the masters, as some had thought, but merely cunningly devised machines that carried them through the world outside. I did not see how this would help Julius and the others much, but it was information. Presumably, I would learn more, a lot more. After that, all Fritz and I needed to discover was a way of making our escape. All. I could have laughed at the thought, but lacked the energy. And I had to remember, of course, my role as one of the capped, a chosen but willing slave. The ramp led into one of the squat pyramids, about halfway up from the base. Inside, there was light from dozens of green globes that hung at varying heights from the ceiling. If anything, the light was brighter than the dusk outside. We were taken along a curving corridor to a long room with a pointed ceiling. Along one side was a row of open-fronted cubicles, their sides made of the hard glass-like substance. Each of us, we were told, was to go into one of these. After that, we were to wait. The masters would come in due course. We waited a long time. For the others, I imagined it was easier. Being filled with the desire to serve the masters above all things would give them patience. Fritz and I had no such comfort. He was in a cubicle some 10 away from mine, and I could not see him. I could see those on either side of me, and dimly the 2 or 3 after that. I was filled increasingly with tension and apprehension, but knew I must not show it. There was discomfort also. Most of us were sitting or lying on the floor to help relieve the drag on our limbs. Lying was best, except for the sweat that had pulled inside the mask, and, uncomfortable anyway, was intolerable if head and shoulders were not upright. By now, also, I was dreadfully thirsty, but there was nothing to drink, and no means of drinking in any case. I wondered if they could have forgotten us. If we were to be left here until we died of thirst and exhaustion, presumably we were of some value to them, but it would not be much. We could be replaced very easily. I sensed rather than heard it at first, but it grew into a ripple of sound, spreading along the cubicle to my right, a sound of awe and wonder, maybe of worship. I knew then that the moment had come, and craned my neck to see. They had entered the room from the far end, and were approaching the cubicles, the masters. For all the discomfort and fatigue, and my fears as to what might happen, my first impulse was to laugh. They were so grotesque. They stood much taller than a man, nearly twice as tall, and were thick in proportion. Their bodies were wider at the bottom than the top, 4 or 5 feet around, I thought, but tapered upward to something like a foot in circumference at the head. If it was the head, for there was no break in the continuity, no sign of a neck. The next thing I noticed was that their bodies were supported not on 2 legs, but 3, these being thick but short. Matching them were 3 arms, or rather tentacles, issuing from a point about halfway up their bodies. And their eyes, I saw that there were 3 of those too, set in a flattened triangle, one above and between the other 2, a foot or so below the crown. The creatures were green, though I saw that the shades differed, some being dark, the green tinged with brown, and others quite pallid. That and the fact that their heights varied to some extent appeared to be the only means of telling one from another. I felt it was a poor one. Later I was to discover that, as one grew accustomed to them, identification was easier than I had expected. The orifices, which were their mouths, nose, and ears, varied too in size, in shape a little, and in their relationship to each other. They were connected by a pattern of wrinkles and creases that one learned to know and recognize. At first impact, though, they were faceless, almost completely uniform. It sent a shiver of quite a different fear down my spine when one of them, stopping before me, spoke. "Boy," he said, "stand up." I thought the words issued from the mouth, which I judged the lower of the 2 central orifices to be, until I saw that it was the upper one that was quivering and open, while the other remained closed and still. With the masters, I was to discover, the organs of breathing and eating were not connected as men's are. They spoke as well as breathed through one, and ate and drank through only the lower, larger opening. I stood up as I was bid. A tentacle came down toward me, touched me lightly, and then more firmly on the arm. It ran along my flesh like a snake, with the dry, smooth texture of a snake, and I repressed a shudder. "Move about," he said. The voice was cold, flat, not loud, but penetrating. "Walk, boy." I began to walk round the narrow confines of the cubicle. I thought of a horse sale I had seen once in Winchester, men feeling the muscles of the beasts, watching them parade around the ring. We did not need to be paraded. We could parade ourselves. The master stood in front of me critically while I made several circuits of the cell. Then, with no other word or comment, he moved on. I stopped walking and let myself slump back into a sitting position. They traveled fast on those stumpy legs, bouncing off the ground with an up and down rhythmic motion. They were clearly vastly stronger than we were to make so light of this leaden city. They could also, when they really wanted to get somewhere fast, spin along like tops, the three legs whirling around and round, and at the same time forward, with yards between each foot touching the ground. I suppose it was their version of running. The choosing went on. Another master came to inspect me, and another. The boy in the next cell was taken. A master ordered him to follow, and he obeyed. They disappeared into the throng. Some masters examined me more closely than others, but all moved on. I wondered if they were suspicious, if something in my behavior were not quite right. I also wondered what would happen if I were not chosen at all. It was known that no one returned from the city. In that case, this particular worry was unnecessary. Those who were not chosen as personal servants went into a general pool, I discovered. But I did not know that at the time, and was aware of the stalls emptying around me. I saw Fritz go past, following a master. We looked at each other, but gave no sign. A master came up to my cubicle, stared at me for a moment, and went on without speaking. Their numbers had thinned, as well as ours. I sat on the floor miserably. I was tired and thirsty, my legs were aching, and the skin of my chest and shoulders was beginning to sting from the salt of my sweat. I leaned my back against the transparent wall and closed my eyes. So I did not see the new master who came, only heard his voice commanding me, "Get up, boy." I thought it was a pleasanter voice than the others had been, with an undertone in it that might almost be warmth. I struggled to my feet and looked at him curiously. Physically, he seemed to be shorter than average, and he was also darker in color. The tinge of brown in the dark green was quite marked. He stared down at me, the skin wrinkling between his eyes, and ordered me to show my paces. I summoned my strength and moved as briskly as I could. Perhaps I had been too lethargic for the others. I was told to stop and did so. The master said, "Come nearer." As I moved toward him, a tentacle snaked out and wrapped around my left arm. I gritted my teeth. A second tentacle stroked appraisingly along my body, assessing my legs, reaching up to wind more closely round my chest in a grip that forced wind from my lungs, then withdrawing. The voice said, "You are a strange one, boy." The words, summing up my chief fears, petrified me. I stared ahead at the featureless column of the monster. There was almost certainly something I should be doing, showing. Excitement? Happiness at the prospect of being allowed to serve one of these absurd and disgusting creatures? I tried to act out that mood, but the master was speaking again. "How did you become a champion at the games? In which of your human sports?" "Boxing," I hesitated, "master." "You are small," he said, "but strong, I think, for your size. Which part of the land do you come from?" "From the south, master, Tyrol." "A mountain land. They are hardy ones who come from the high parts." He fell silent then. The tentacle that still held my left arm released it and dropped back. The three eyes stared at me. Then the voice said, "Follow me, boy." I had found my master.